Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Giller Book Club. I'm Jacob Alvarado, and I'll be your host for tonight. Just a couple quick reminders before we get things started. First off, please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible viewing experience. Also note that this conversation will be followed by a Q&A period, so if you have any questions for Claire throughout the conversation, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. It's now my profound pleasure to introduce you to our interviewer for this evening, Susan Swan. A novelist, journalist, activist, and teacher, Susan Swan's impact on the Canadian literary and political scene has been far-reaching. She is best known for her novels The Biggest Woman in the World and The Wives of Bath, which was made into the feature film Lost and Delirious. Swan is the co-founder of the Carol Shields Prize for Fiction, which is the largest literary award in the world for women and non-binary authors, and she recently received an Order of Canada for her writing and her work on the Shields Prize. Her memoir, Big Girls Don't Cry, will be published on May 29th, 2025 in Canada by HarperCollins and by Beacon Press in the US. Tonight, Susan's going to be interviewing Claire Messud, whose fantastic novel, This Strange Eventful History, was longlisted for the Giller Prize last year. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Claire and Susan. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Jacob.
Jacob.
Oh, go ahead, Claire. Did you
No,
want
I just said thanks, Jacob.
Oh, all right. Yes, we're both thanking you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Claire, whose best-selling novels include The Emperor's Children in 2006, The Woman Upstairs in 2013, and The Burning Girl 2017. Her work has been translated into over 20 languages. Her most recent novel, This Strange Eventful History, which we're talking about tonight, was longlisted for the 2024 Booker and Giller Prize and was selected as a Book of the Year by the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Scotsman, the New Yorker, and Vogue, among others, and as a top 10 historical novel by the New York Times. And I'm going to turn it over to Claire just for a minute to describe this strange, eventful history, because it is an epic novel. It covers 3 generations of a family who started out as Algerians. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. And I just want to say, first of all, a huge thank you to you for doing this conversation with me tonight. It's a big honor and a joy to be with you. And thank you to Jacob and everybody at the Giller Prize Book Club. So yes, The Strange Eventful History is it is one of those. There used to be that online or YouTube thing or whatever video thing called Jackass, where it was like, don't try this at home, don't sort of jump off the top of your garage. And I feel like as a creative writing teacher, I would sort of say, if I were asked, I would say to my students, don't do this, which is it spans 70 years. It starts in 1940 and ends in 2010, and it has 5 perspectives. Almost all are third person, but one is first person. And it tells the story, as you mentioned, of 3 generations of a family that is a French colonial family in Algeria, and that ends up spread out around the world and traveling in sort of, I guess you'd say, in diaspora in a way. I don't know, but not in France largely.
Yeah, there aren't there 5 countries?
Yes. There may be more than 5 there are 5.
Can you name all the countries that the generations live in, which is really astonishing?
So there's Algeria, but it opens in Greece, and there's reference to them living also in Lebanon, and then there is Switzerland, Canada, Argentina, Australia, France, the US.
America too.
Yeah. So lots of different places.
No, it's incredible, the number of places that they live. I mean, I wrote a novel about Casanova once, who was a great traveler, and he used to say, when you choose a country, choose the country as if you're choosing a lover. and go to that country with the same fervor that you might go to meet your lover. But he grew up in Venice and already had a sort of solid Venetian identity. Anyway, I'm going to ask you, after you read the prologue, a question about how you create an identity when you grow up in 5 countries as a kid. I mean, it's just astonishing. Anyway, read us your prologue. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Okay, so the prologue is spoken by a character, Chloe, who then doesn't show up. She's the youngest of the 3 generations, and she doesn't show up after that until the middle of the book. And because this was, it's fiction and a bunch of it's made up, but it's sort of inspired by my own father's family's history. You would probably have to say that the character of Chloe is the one that comes, is closest to the author.
Mhm.
I'm a writer. I tell stories. Of course, really, I want to save lives, or simply, I want to save life. I'm a writer. I tell stories. I want to tell the stories of their lives. It doesn't really matter where I start. We're always in the middle. Wherever we stand, we see only partially. I know also that everything is connected, the constellations of our lives moving together in harmony and disharmony. The past swirls along with and inside the present, and all time exists at once around us. The ebb and flow, the harmonies and dissonance, the music happens whether or not we describe it. A story is not a line, it is a richer thing, one that circles and eddies, rises and falls, repeats upon itself. And so this story, the story of my family, has many possible beginnings or none. Mare Nostrum, St. Augustine, Abdelkader, Charles de Gaulle, my grandparents, Larba, my father, my aunt, Zora Drift, my mother, Albert Camus, Toronto, Cambridge, Toulon, Tlemcen, Tlemcen. All and each a part of the vast and intricate web. Any version only partial. Or I could begin with my birth, or my father's birth, or his father's birth, or my mother's or grandmother's. I could begin with the secrets and shame, the ineffable shame that in telling their story I would wish at last to heal. The shame of the family history, of the history into which we were born. How to forget that after attending the birth of his first grandson, my father, elderly then, tripped on the curb and fell in the street, a toppled mountain. And as he lay with the white down of his near bald head in the gutter's muck, he muttered, not help me, but I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I could begin, of course, with the aloneness. It doesn't matter so much where this story begins as that it begins. And if, as I've come to understand, the story is infinitely expanding rather than a line or thread, then wherever I start is merely that, not the beginning, but a mere moment, a way of happening, a mouth.
Thank you. That's very beautiful. The father that falls into the gutter is François, and he is like you, has, I think, in the novel, he grows up in about 5 countries, or 4 countries anyway. Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself about how many countries you grew up in, just so the listener can understand that you are eminently qualified to write this saga?
um, so my father was French and pieds-noirs, French from Algeria, and my mother was Canadian from Toronto, and we my sister was actually born in France and I was born in the United States, so I was the only American in my family, and we lived in the U.S. till I was 4, and then we lived in Sydney, Australia till I was 9, and then we lived in Toronto, Canada until I was almost 14. And then my father's work took us back to the US, at which point, because they thought they might have to move again, my parents sent us to boarding school because they thought that we might not get through high school in one place. But they ended up staying quite a long time in the US. And when I turned 21, I sponsored them for green cards because they had all that time had just my dad's work visa. And then
Incredible.
yeah, and then I went to study after college. I went to study in the UK, and I ended up spending basically 7 years there, and then came back to North America.
That's very dizzying. I just can't imagine how you were able to cope with all those different environments and your characters as you write about them. I mean, they do cope with these different environments. They do go into them, like, you know, what Miss Casanova says, another world is possible. There's something wonderful about having a brand new world to be part of and discover and explore and see if it suits you. But how do you form an identity when you've been in so many places so intimately at such a young age? How do you see yourself as a cosmopolitan or an American? Or, I mean, when you think about yourself quietly, do you think of yourself as a Canadian or?
It's a really good question. You know, I mean, I think there are lots of answers. I would say, one thing I would say is that when I was a child, I remember my grandfather saying, "Your family is home. Your family is your home." And I think there is certainly truth to that. And it doesn't need to be your birth family. I mean, it can be, I mean, a family of choice, you know. But I've become aware, you know, that I think a huge number of people live in the world in that way. I mean, the 20th century,
It's very contemporary.
yeah, but even the mid 20th century, you know, at the time before even in the first half of the 20th century, with all of the, you know, people heading to the New World, whether to North America or South America or you know, or Australia. I mean, it's been a long stretch of much migration or much movement, and a lot of people have experiences different versions, you know, iterations of this sort of peripatetic or migratory existence. And so I think in it does feel contemporary, and it doesn't also um, I think what's interesting about it is that it's something in a post-colonial world, right? It's both the colonizers and the colonized often, right? I mean, I feel like everybody is sort of
One big sort of muddle in a way.
yeah, moved around and kind of repositioned in a whole different world or context.
I
So
think totally correct. And your novel reminded me with its sort of one of its themes about the fluidity of home. It reminded me of an Elizabeth Bishop poem, Questions of Travel. And I just wanted to read this last stanza of that poem, which describes your novel, I think. Continent, city, country, society. The choice is never free and here or there. No. Should we have stayed at home, wherever that may be? I was struck by that phrase, wherever that may be. And your grandfather's answer that home is the family is actually quite a good answer, because your novel does illustrate that. Do you want to tell us about the document that he wrote that you discovered or was given? I don't know how you came upon it. I'm not quite clear about that. Did he present it to you when you were children, or how did that happen? Tell us about that, because that triggered this novel, didn't it?
it did, in fact. So my grandfather, who was born in 1905, spent several years of his retirement in the 1970s. He lived to be quite old. He lived well into his 90s. Um, but he in his early years of retirement, he wrote, I mean, it's close to 1,500 pages handwritten,
Wow.
a family memoir for my sister and me. I mean, it was not designed for publication. It's not written for the wider world. It's, you know, it's addressed to us, and
That's a very touching title, Everything We Believed In.
everything we believed in. And I think so, you know, I think I was so, I didn't read it fully. I had read little bits, but I didn't read it fully until about eight years ago. I guess I'd read he made a sort of condensed version that he got typed up that was sort of 200 pages, and that I had read, you know, 25 years ago. But so we always knew about it, and these binders, and they have also in them photographs and telegrams, you know, stuck with Scotch tape that's now sort of coming unstuck. But all of these sort of old documents, letters, you know, um, and they were in 5 red binders up near his desk in his apartment. in France. And so when that apartment was sold, he had died long before, but we kept the apartment as long as we could. And then it was sold in 2016, and I put those binders in a suitcase and I brought them back to my house, and that was when I read them. That was when I read them all.
So you read them in your home, and is that when you thought, I have to write a novel about this? How did that how did you jump creatively from the document to your, the world of fiction?
Well, so the document covers 1928 to 1946, and it doesn't go beyond 1946. And so my novel actually starts in 1940 and goes, well beyond. So, but my initial idea had been, oh, I would write 5 short novels. And my editor said, no, you will not, Claire. Her name's Jill Baileski, and she's very wonderful. And she was like, no, Claire, you will write 1 novel. So then I had to sort of figure out how to cover this sort of span of history that I wanted to in one. No, but so there isn't actually that much that's taken directly from my grandfather's memoir. Just although there in the opening of the book there are things that happened in 1940 that did actually happen, and then there are things that I sort of had to cut out because there was sort of too much historical detail or information, and I think it was a little bogged down. But just one example of something that came out of the novel that was taken out after. I mean, it was in the draft and it was in the revision and then it was taken out. As the novel opens in what was then Salonika and is now Thessaloniki in Greece in 1940, and my grandfather wrote in his memoir about the fact that in, I think, early May of 1940, a French journalist came from Paris to see him and said, I know he was the naval attaché. So he was he was basically military attaché at the consulate. And the guy said, I know that you're not allowed to tell us, but we all in Paris need to know that Weygand's army is on its way. And so General Weygand was one of the, military leaders. And there was a rumor, fake news, there was a rumor in Paris that he had mustered an army in the Levant, that there was a sort of whole large, army of led by French people, but Syrian and Lebanese colonial soldiers who were on their way, who were going to come in and save the day as the Germans were approaching, and the French clearly weren't ready to fight, but there was this whispering going around that I don't worry because they're on their way from they're on their way
Like the cavalry coming in the
Right.
old Hollywood movies of the West, the cavalry
from the Middle East.
arriving at the last minute, but of course they didn't come.
They didn't exist. So, the journalist said to my grandfather, I know you're not allowed to tell me, but please tell me. And my grandfather said, I can't tell you that. It's not true. And the guy kept insisting, I know you're lying. I know you're lying, please, but it gives you a sense of the sort of panicky disarray, in France at the time.
Yeah, no, it must have been terrible. The the experiences that many of the characters and your family went through. But the world events, interestingly enough, don't really get described in detail. It's the life of the family and their interactions and the way the world treats them that is really the subject of your book, it seems, whereas someone else might write about how they were directly shaped by these cataclysmic events, but no, it's how they interacted as people and individuals and a family member. And Chloe is the sort of the glue that holds them all together, I guess, who is a kind of avatar of you. And she has this interesting idea that I wanted to ask you about. It comes up in your prologue. You want to, Chloe wants to protect her family and basically save their lives. And this incredible sense of responsibility. She even sleeps outside on a balcony to ward off burglars. Is that not true? Because she thinks she's protecting the family.
Yes, but it's not I mean, it's not that uncommon, I think, for children to feel, weirdly responsible.
No, I think that's absolutely true. It made me remember when I was small that I used to count trees and think that it was very important because the trees were getting cut down all the time to make houses. And I thought in my, my imagination, if I could just keep a count of the trees, brought it all back, that I would somehow save them. And there's something really extraordinary about that, about the world of a child, and then the world of the novelist, where you create an alternative to the real world, where you're keeping it safe. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the role of the writer? Are you really trying to save lives, as you say, and how does that work exactly?
It's a really,
Probably a terrible question.
it's a great question, but I don't know if I have a good answer. I mean, I think, any of us, I mean, people write for all sorts of different reasons, and people read for all sorts of different reasons. But I know that one of the things that I love as a reader is being immersed in a world, and it's funny, for years I used to teach Tolstoy's boyhood. There's boyhood, childhood, youth, which is, the first things that he wrote, and unfinished. I mean, you sort of turn the page of youth and it doesn't end. It just stops. But it is like looking through a pane of glass onto a country estate in sort of 1830s Russia. And and you feel everything the little boy feels, and you smell what he smells and know what he knows, and have the passion that he has for his mother, who, I think it's not a spoiler to say, dies when he's young. But I think that the great paradox, of course, of writing. When I what if somebody says to me, what's the point of writing fiction? And my answer is, it's to try to capture some small fragment of what it's like to be alive on the planet. Not necessarily what it's like to be me at all. I mean, what it's like, but just what it's like to be alive. Um, and
Well, I was talking to Isabel Huggan, who wrote a book about called Belonging, which is about again about moving from Canada and living in France and being in a different place, and Jane Urquhart. And they were both saying in our discussion that fiction, there's a chance that it might last. You write this, you memorialize it, and there's a chance that it might last, and that is a way of keeping the world safe. And I wondered what you thought of that.
I,
You're
I,
giving
I,
a kind of bit more, immortality to this world, so that people will know it for a long, long time, perhaps, hopefully.
and even if it's, I mean, I think this about my grandfather's memoir, that, I believe I'm the only, because my sister has read parts of it, but she hasn't read the whole thing yet. I'm the only person to have read the whole thing. And
Wow.
and and yet what's alive in my mind, what I mean, I know my grandparents as young people before I, before my dad was born. I know where they liked to walk and what movies they went to, and who they went out for dinner with, and I had this extraordinary experience because I was invited to the Salon du Livre in Algiers in November, and of course it's not that easy to go to Algeria, and I was able to go just for a few days, but it was the strangest experience because, of course, I'd never been there, but I felt as though I'd been there,
Yeah, in a way,
because of everything he.
imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel as though what I can get quite rhapsodic or sentimental about, just when you think about, I feel as though, the internet pales in comparison to the power of the written word, and the idea that squiggles on paper can make images and experiences in our minds that we remember as if we had lived them. I mean,
It's magic, and you have a virtuoso ability to describing places. You've got a great sense of place and the culture and the customs, You talk about François drinking lemon squash, and is it La Raba? How do you say the Algerian town? La Raba? The
Just Larba.
Thank you. And you immediately, it feels authentic. And people have compared you to Henry James because you are more descriptive than a lot of contemporary fiction. But in a way, it reminded me a bit of Karl Knausgaard, the Norwegian novelist, who will spend a lot of time talking about the domestic routines and details and uses it somehow as a springboard to have these philosophical riffs. And you kind of use specific details of and the sense of place as a way for us to go into, the deepest meanings possible and to create this intimacy with the reader. Well, I think one of your critics said they ended up feeling like a member of the Cassar family. And I had that feeling too. I felt, yes, this is my family. Everything was so well observed and reported on. And I was curious about the sense of responsibility. When you were young, were you feeling all the time that you had to kind of pay attention to everything so that you would remember it? How did you develop that ability to be able to describe things in such incredible, believable detail?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great compliment. It's funny. Yes, there must have been something about maybe about knowing that we were never anywhere for long that made me feel like I had to remember. I mean, for some reason I was remembering it the other day, and of course, we all know now that every time we take a memory out, we change it, right? So, but I do have a very distinct memory. We left Australia for the last time, when we were moving away. It was December 27th, 1975, and I remember being in the back of the cab, and summertime, and the vinyl under my thighs was really hot, and my legs stuck to the vinyl, and I had rolled down the window, and the air was hot, and I remember looking out the window and thinking, remember this, remember this. This is the last time. You won't see this again. Remember this. And of course, I haven't been back a ton of times, but I have since 1975. I've had the good fortune to go back to Sydney a few times, but
You
certainly
write a diary or a notebook at that time?
my mother was always exhorting us to write diaries, and I have a couple of, somewhere in the piles of, the boxes of stuff, there are diaries, but I would say they're a little scanty. Little
Amazing. I thought you must have written down these details years ago or something, but they're all there, and they're not obtrusive. They create an environment that you just move through and accept utterly. It's just very convincing. Perhaps Knausgaard isn't a good comparison to your work, but just in that particular aspect. I was wondering what contemporary writers you think are working in a similar vein to you right now.
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there are lots of writers who I admire, and some of them I feel sort of overlaps with, and others I admire and know that I could never do, never do what they do. I'm a great admirer of Knausgaard. There's that passage in the first book, the first uh, uh, um, of my struggle, where he's writing about, after his father's death, going with his brother to his grandmother's apartment or house where his father was living, and trying to clean it up, and it has sort of fallen, everything has fallen into terrible, terrible disarray, and it's unbelievably vivid.
Drunk and their bottles, and he's defecated in places, and yeah.
Awful, but it's so
Wow.
vivid, and it's so, I mean, that is an experience that I feel has entered my memory as though I lived it. The details are so vivid to me. There's a bird that comes every day that his grandmother feeds the bird, even though his grandmother seems completely out of it, but then they suddenly worry that maybe she's not out of it, and maybe she, realized that her son was dead in the chair and went to bed anyway. I mean, it's incredibly powerful,
Yeah,
but it's very materially filled. I mean, it's sort
yes,
of
it is.
more Ibsen than Chekhov, if you will.
Yes.
Like it's the stage is full of material things, and I think I am somebody who does fill the stage, as it were, with material things. I have kids who are in their early 20s, and my son, I think, wishes that life were like the Apple Store, that it was sort of clean and uncluttered,
Yeah.
and there's fiction that really is like the Apple Store. It's sort of super clean and spare, and I'm sort of the opposite of that.
That's not your aesthetic. No. I know my mother, who wanted to be a writer, she treated each item that she'd inherited from her grandparents as if it was a person. Like every, domestic, the plates, the glasses, they were incredibly personal, and you got this sense of family through these, goods that were basically passed on. They weren't particularly worth millions of dollars, and they certainly weren't spare. They were really into clutter, and so she never threw anything out because it was like getting rid of part of herself. And I always found that very, very fascinating. Um, I wanted to ask you also about the shameful secret. There is a shameful secret was that shameful secret in your grandfather's document?
No, no, it was not in the document. That shameful secret was known. I mean, was known to us. I mean, not when I was a child, but it was known. I don't think.
There was a shameful secret in your family too. Is that what
Yeah, there was not. That was not a. That was not a. And what I would say is that was. It's hard to talk about it without sort of being explicit, and maybe we.
yeah, I don't want to give it away because it's the end of the book, but I was interested whether it was something that had been in his document or something that you created for sort of narrative.
No, but it was, it was a thing, but I would also say it was not for them shameful. It was not for them shameful. But I mean, for my grandparents, it was not shameful. But other people had.
But other people had different ideas. Yeah. Well, you put you expose that, reveal that is a better word, reveal that at the end of your novel. Why did you choose to reveal it at the end rather than at the beginning?
Well, again, this is a thing that as a teacher, we talk a lot with students. I talk a lot with students about, from Forster's aspects of the novel. He makes this distinction between plot and story, which isn't exactly as you might imagine it, but I don't know if you know that,
Tell our listeners or viewers that what it is. I think it's very interesting.
So he has the example, the king died, the queen died, is the story, and the king died, the queen died of grief, is the plot. And that's motivation. And then he goes on to say the order in which you reveal the information makes meaning, right? So that as writers, we're making a decision whether to tell something in flashback or to tell something straight ahead, or,
Yes,
typically, or in some sort of mosaic of different timepieces,
yes,
together. And every decision we make creates a different story. So if you just take the bald linear facts, the way that you arrange them makes a different meaning of the same set of facts, or can do. And I think in that regard, as I always say to my students, imagine if it, with Germany, the Holocaust wasn't the first thing you knew, but the Holocaust is the first thing you know. And then when you know about, I don't know, Beethoven, or Goethe, you're thinking, well, yes, the desire for world domination was there, 150 years before, or 200 years before. You start making a narrative that is entirely informed by the lens of what you know first. And if you think of that in life, I'm a younger child, so I grew up a lot of my childhood. We weren't always at the same school, but when we were at the same school, I'd walk into classroom, and the teacher would say, "Oh, you're Elizabeth's little sister." And they had a whole story of who I was or would
Just
be
from her.
that was based on who they thought she was. So the story is different depending what you know and don't know. And if you knew what's talked about at the end of the book, at the beginning of the book, you'd have a completely different idea of the people, I think.
Yes, as you've written it, you don't have a sense that the shameful secret shaped them. You have the sense that they were, in many respects, a kind of not exactly ordinary, but a kind of ordinary family with ordinary fears and likes and loves. And if you'd put it at the front of the book, we would have been looking all the time for how, especially now where there's so much interest in trauma, about how that affected their behavior. And oh, Chloe must have done that because she knows about the grandfather and grandmother. And we don't have that. So it seemed to me almost as if you were saying all families carry some kind of secret and this is theirs. Right?
I think all families do. And I think for me also there's some sense, and this is not something I would, thought about growing up or thought about, but there's some sense of colonialism, right? Is a version of that too, is that
Yes.
it
A
is
shameful secret in a sense.
shameful secret that they didn't. I mean, the difference in generations, that's part for me of what the novel is about. From my grandparents' generation, there was no shame. There was a sense of a sort of, the beautiful, amazing, enlightened France exporting its, its
Generous, an act of generosity or
right,
something.
with an act of generosity, giving religion, giving Catholic religion, giving
Yeah.
education, giving all of these things to the poor people who hadn't had them, hadn't had these blessings. And then you get to my parents' generation, and in the post-war moment, it was very difficult to maintain that fantasy. And it became something, shameful. And then, with one generation's removed, there's a moment in the novel where the Chloe character, I didn't actually say to I in real life didn't say to my grandfather, "Have you read Frantz Fanon?" But the grandfather character in the book says, "No, I haven't." I mean, as sort of North American at university studying post-colonial theory, you have a completely different attitude than somebody who, was born in the country that their grandparents were born in, as a colonial without ever thinking about it.
Yeah, the different perspectives of the generations. Well, I wondered, and also I sense in you, and has to do with the revealing of the secret at the end. Also, you are in your way a kind of disruptor of the reader's expectations in the sense that you're not going to follow just the traditional norms of storytelling. You have a mission, I get, and this is very subtle, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I get the sense you feel you have a mission to show the reader that what they might expect fiction to be isn't quite that. It could be this. So have a look at this. And I was very touched. I remember when your other, I suppose the most controversial novel of yours came out, The Woman Upstairs, about this very difficult woman who inserted herself into a family because they appeared to have everything that she wanted. And she wasn't particularly likable. And you spend a lot of time trying to explain to critics that female characters didn't have to be likable. And they don't, but there is that expectation that they that they should be nice still, just as there is with women, and women expect that of themselves quite a lot too. I think we want to be nice. So I'm wondering, do you have a sense of mission in terms of telling a story, and that you're in a way, in a charming way, educating the reader? And how much does teaching influence you in your writing and your conversations after a book comes out where you have to, where you're put on the spot, like, why did you write about an unlikable woman? As if that's the worst thing that could possibly happen, right?
Yes, the likability question. I mean, I think I don't feel a sort of educational mission per se, but it does seem to me, um, when I was saying earlier about trying to capture something of what it's like to be alive, I feel like, well, there's no point lying about that. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Why would you tell
Right.
a fake for
Yeah.
I remember in high school, in my senior year in high school, I had this amazing English teacher, and we had this amazing syllabus. And one of the things that we read in my senior year in the fall semester was Notes from the Underground. And I remember reading and thinking, but Dostoevsky. I remember thinking, and that's an unreliable and not likable character. And I remember thinking, you can write about these emotions, you can write about this stuff, you can write about, your petty rage and
Oh,
insecurity, and
yeah.
you could, and that for me was a thrilling revelation, because it meant that you could tell the truth about things that you weren't supposed to, confess to your mom.
And that's one of the things fiction does, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And
it tells truths that quite often people don't want to hear too, which anyway, so that was a kind of permission giving for you, seeing that.
yes, and I think also, eventually, some sense of responsibility as a writer I mean, that's a whole longer conversation maybe for another day, but I was always in youth the voice of doom and gloom. I was the person who felt that if the story ended happily, it was untrue. And then I think in my own personal experiences as life went along, um, I came to realize that isn't true, that actually, everybody does die, but sometimes there are moments of incredible forgiveness or grace or generosity, or that, there's a rainbow in the sky when, I mean, I feel as though that I'm much less yeah, gloomy than I think I was at
The
20.
truth isn't always negative. In
Right,
other
right.
words. Is that what
But
you're
but but the truth is the truth over time is rarely simplistically jolly. I mean,
saying? Yes.
so 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 I guess I do feel I feel bound to my experience of that as a truth, that life is
Well,
complicated. Sometimes you
yeah,
need.
light and darkness, I guess. And the writer's job is to show both. But I was very struck, and I don't mean to imply that there's anything educational in the way you approach your fiction, because there isn't. But I'm probably responding more to these conversations quite often with the female journalists, because I had that starting out as a writer, where I was criticized for not providing positive images of women. This was by feminist critics.
Right?
And I remember being sort of startled by that. I didn't know that I'd been given this role, that I was supposed to uphold women as perfect human beings, because to be human is to come with pluses and minuses. So, and I remember having some of those conversations, and I did feel like I had to explain, because they didn't seem to understand that about fiction. So I was, that's just a writerly, sympathy I'm
Yes, I mean,
expressing to you.
I can imagine. I know that you've had similar things. I mean, I suppose that what I come to feel sometimes is that people who are making that case, that your character should be exemplary in some way, are people who aren't really readers of fiction, and who don't,
Mm.
because it seems to me that there's that wonderful, it's the epigraph to Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, which is about Novalis. And it's an epigraph from Novalis, and I'm going to misquote it, but it's basically saying literature exists to fill the gaps of history. And the fact is, right, that human experience is overdetermined. We can be good people who are grumpy and badly behaved, even as we're, morally. I mean, I remember when my parents, my mom, when she was unwell, she had Lewy body dementia, and she lived with us. And every 10 minutes she would say, "Can I need to go, I think I need to go to the bathroom." And I'd say, "Mom, again?" Again. And I remember saying to my husband, "Well, if I'm grumpy, does it still count?" But I feel like that's I mean, that's what it is to be human, is, it's like third time or fourth time in an hour that you're helping your mom go to the bathroom, and
Yeah.
and you're grumpy about it.
No, that's a very good point. I see that it's time for me to point out to the audience that they should submit questions, because I've been kind of hogging you here. And so questions will appear on my chat, I think. But I don't see any questions. No questions yet. So I'm going to ask another question then. Is that what Jacob would like me to do? Should I continue on with my questions then if the audience is listening and not asking? So this is the question I have, which struck me. The marriage of Barbara, that's the Canadian mother of Chloe, and François, the Algerian born, I think, boy who was the one who traveled to America and Australia and New York and all those places as a corporate man. They had a very tragic marriage in the novel. She really wanted to be a lawyer and in Australia studied law, but then had to kind of put that aside for the family. And on some level, that seemed to have kind of crippled her psychologically. And the husband, Francois, he really had wanted to be a writer or express himself creatively somehow. And he had decided that his first job was to look after the family, to support them. So neither was getting their first heart's desire, and they quite often made each other miserable. And I wondered if you thought in the traditional family, are sacrifices required like that for a family to work? Was that something that belonged to the 20th century, but is not true of the 21st century? Because they're a perfect example of two people. I don't think they were particularly mismatched from the way you've described them. They just couldn't fulfill their ambitions, their real, in the most sort of emotionally involved ambitions.
I mean, I think all human relationships are just hard. So,
Yes.
and so I think, would that we could say, oh, it was just in the 20th century and now it's all better, but we know that's, we all know that's not true. It's just difficult. But I think, one of the things that does change, um, we're shaped by so many factors, and we hold beliefs that seem to us immovable and unchangeable, that are actually, just beliefs. So in that generation, which is the generation of my parents, I think there was, they were born in the early 30s, and they came of age in the 1950s. There were still quite, you know, quite strict, maybe the wrong word, but limiting ideas of what the roles of women were or should be. And there were many women who were bucking those conventions, but those conventions still existed. I was on a plane, and I saw a biopic that it was not the world's best film, but I was all weepy about the French politician Simone Weil, not the saintly philosopher, but the hands-on politician. And she was married with a kid, and she said, "I'm going to go to law school." And her husband said, "You can't do that." And everybody around her said, "You can't do that." And she did it anyway. And she became a very important figure in French politics in the second half of the 20th century. But it took a moment of real, um, uh, initiative and sort of daring on her part. She was,
Yeah, great courage, really.
contradicting what everybody around her was saying that she ought to do. And but by 19, so that was maybe the case in 1954, say, but by 1974, as you know well, the battle was raging, right? Like by 1974, it wasn't a given at all. So, and in 1974, my mom wasn't old, but she was too old to,
Change.
I mean, she had two little kids and,
Yeah.
and she moved around the world and, hadn't had a job outside the home. And, I mean, so I think that thing, I often, this is not the character in the novel, this is my mom, but she was a staunch feminist and she read all the feminist texts, but there was always some sense that she was like the person standing on the shore waving at the feminist boat, as
As
it,
it passed her by.
yeah.
Yeah. No, their story is very sad, but yet they did sort of work out some kind of truce as couples quite often do, I guess. I see that we have a question here. And the first question is, do you always intend on beginning with the prologue, or did you write that later?
That's a good question. Let me remember. I think I did write that first, actually, but I could be telling a fib. I mean, I think um what is certainly true is that I was editing it right to the end. There was a prologue in the beginning that was much longer, and I mean, it may have been called at the time chapter one, and it had scenes and it had conversations and it had and it was sort of set at the end, you know. It was sort of set in 2010. And then eventually it got sort of pared back and rewritten and pared back into something. Um,
Because
a-
people don't quite often understand how many times a novel can be rewritten or revised. And this
yeah.
was revised quite a few times, you're saying.
Yes. I mean, and I don't know about if you feel this way, but I always feel like the beginning is the very last and you don't know how the beginning you want it to feel or what it should feel, what it feels like even until you get to the end, and even then you're still figuring it out.
That's a good answer to that question. So theoretically, to the questioner, she could have written the prologue last because she had to get to the end to really figure out what it really should say. And it is a lengthy novel. It must have been very a job of work to get to wrestle it into the shape that you did with all the information you had. Anyway, all right. So here is Karen Smythe. Should I read this? And we have some book recommendations to do. Maybe we'll start with Karen. Karen says, "Good evening and thank you both for this wonderful conversation. Claire, I haven't read your novel, but I'm picking up on something Susan said about you showing with this book that novels can be different from what readers often expect them to be. Can you talk about aspects of this novel that are perhaps experimental or innovative?"
Um, it's funny. I think thank you for that question. I there was one of the reviewers in the United States who said um Messud uses old tricks, but they are quite effective. But I was like, old tricks? Would that be narrative? What's the old trick? Because there isn't a sort of it isn't something that where it's not plot driven in a sense at all. I mean, I think one of the things that I as a reader am not especially preoccupied with plot. I feel it's important. It's incumbent upon a writer not to let a reader be bored. That it's not as though, I'm always just interested in people. So, people just being people is interesting to me. The
The
small,
experience of their lives and recreating it in the mind of the reader seems more important to you than having a drama that comes from a plot. Would that be?
yes, yes, I feel exactly that way. And but I think, then the question of how to, for me, the novel is about trying to tell the story of a family and then against the backdrop of all of these, sort of big historical events of which they were a part or which affected them, not because they were important, not because they were major actors, but because to be alive. And the epigraph that I took from the novel, for the novel, which I might, perhaps I could just read,
Sure.
which is from Elias Canetti. His life in which nothing, absolutely nothing happened. He embarked on no adventures. He was in no war. He was never in prison. He never killed anyone. He neither won nor lost a fortune. All he ever did was live in this century, but that alone was enough to give his life dimension, both of feeling and of thought. And I think that was sort of, insofar as, that was what I was trying to convey, is that, I mean, this will sound maybe sappy, but every ordinary life is actually replete with event and meaning. You don't
That's
have
true.
you don't have to be in a war. You don't have to run a country. You don't have to, you don't have to be a king. You just live, and
And that is the story. Yes, we often hear as writers that people will say to me, well, I should write a book. I have a book in me. But I've come to think as I've got older that our lives are books. And we're quite often driven by themes that we don't know at the time. As Kierkegaard says, life has to be lived. To understand your life, you have to live it backwards in a way. You don't really know till the end. But it is, yeah, we're kind of films unfolding, or books, pages of books being written as we experience things, and so each person doesn't have to write a book. They are their own narrative, their own book. They're the hero of their own story. And it's very beautiful, I think.
I love that. I absolutely agree. I think that's really true. And in that sense, the number of books there could be is infinite. Yeah.
It's infinite. Okay, I'm looking, we've got 2 minutes. Do we have any book recommendations? What are you reading now? Maybe that's something to ask.
What am I reading right now? I am reading Katie Kitamura's new novel Audition, which is just been published, and I'm not sure if you are familiar with her work.
I don't, tell us about her.
She's a I'm not sure if this is her fourth or fifth novel. And she is, when I mentioned earlier, they're people I admire hugely, and they're very different from me. I mean, her writing is her sentences are beautiful and elegant and long and lush, but there's no kind of no clutter in the scene. You know,
In the
that
scene, in the scene.
it's very, her characters have a sort of essential quality, a kind of real purity of line in her
Hmm.
descriptions, and and interiority and voice are very important. And in this case, it's the narrator is an aging actress, who's going through a number of experiences and relating them, and there's a lot of play on theater and performance, and the performance of a self, and what is a self, is there an interior self, or are we actually a sort of uh,
Collage of something, or
a
a
lot of performances that that make, and so there's a lot of food for thought, a lot of delicious pleasure in the sentences, and in the characterizations, but yeah, wonderful, and very, you were saying my book is long. Her books are quite slim, so
Oh, it's the opposite.
that's a
Say your name again. I think it's 8 o'clock and we have to go. I would just tell the audience to read all the 5 books on the short list of the Carol Shields Prize that just come out. You can Google it, and it will give you the short list. And thank you very much. That was a wonderful exchange. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Oh man, I really hate that I have to cut you guys off. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you both so much for your time tonight. Thanks everybody in the audience for making time for us tonight. I hope you enjoyed hearing from these two as much as I did. A couple quick reminders before we get going. If you know somebody who couldn't make it this evening, please let them know that this interview will be available on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days or so you can check that out then. Please also join us in a couple weeks' time for our next Giller Book Club on Wednesday, April 30th. We'll be hearing from writer and translator Wayne Grady, who's going to be interviewing Logan Paylor about Logan's long-listed novel, The Cure for Drowning. If you've already joined our mailing list, then you'll be sent a registration link right to your inbox. But if you haven't done that yet, then please head over to gillerprize.ca and sign up. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care, everybody.
Good night, and thank you, Claire. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.